Okay, so let's say that the government decides that it wants to stimulate the economy, but it doesn't want to incur more debt. So, usually when we talk about government spending, the government borrows money and then spends it on the economy. Okay, it's very rare the government will take revenue, surpluses from previous years and actually spend on the economy. Usually they borrow money to spend on the economy. Okay, but of course, if the government doesn't want to borrow money, if they want their budget to be balanced, what they can do is they can collect higher taxes. They can tax people at higher amounts, and then spend all that money to stimulate the economy. Okay, in government spending. And I want to take a second to ask the question: well, if they collect a certain amount of money and then spend all of in taxes, and then spend all of that in the economy, will our economy actually grow? Because after all, if they collect taxes, that reduces consumption. So wouldn't our net effect be nothing? So let's actually look at a situation where we have a recessionary gap, and clearly there's a recessionary gap here. I'm changing the numbers a little bit. The GDP gap between potential and actual GDP, instead of being 1 trillion, it's now 200 billion. So the recessionary gap is obviously smaller, and it's this vertical distance. And so let's say that our marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.8. That means that our multiplier will equal 5. Okay. Now let's say, and I'm going to pick a number, and you'll see in a second why I'm picking that number, but let's just say that the government decides to tax people, increase people's taxes. Okay, the government increases taxes by $200 trillion, or $200 billion, okay? $200 billion, okay? And then the government takes all that increase in taxes, takes all that money collected from everyone, all the people, and then the government puts that money back into the economy directly. So the government increases spending by exactly the same amount, $200 billion. So the question is, what's going to happen? Well, let's look at each effect. Let's look at the tax increase. Okay? The tax increase will lead to consumption decreasing. Right? Consumption decreases by how much? Well, it decreases by 80% of the tax increase. Because remember that when you tax people, they have less money. When they have less money, they don't only consume less, they also save less. And they will consume less, 80% of the amount that they don't have now. Okay? And they will save 20% less of the amount that they don't have anymore because they had to give that money to the government. So consumption will decrease, but it will only decrease by 80% of 200 billion, which is 160 billion. Right? And savings will decrease by 40 billion. Okay? But really what we're interested in is what's going on with consumption. So I'm just going to erase that part, okay, but just so you know, saving obviously goes down. It's important, we'll come back to it later, okay? All right. So, this might be seen by basically having this happen, which is not what we want, right? We want our GDP, our aggregate expenditure line to go up so that we can reach potential GDP. All right, but of course we're not leaving it there, right? We also said that the government will increase spending by 200 billion. And so G, government spending increase, that will lead to literally a government spending increase of 200 billion, right? I mean, that's just a direct effect, obviously, right? And so the net effect, what I want you guys to see is that there's going to be a net effect of a positive $40 billion increase in aggregate expenditure because consumption goes down only by 160 billion, government spending goes up by 200 billion, And so the net effect is that there will be a $40 billion increase in aggregate expenditure in our SIG-X line, right? And the way we're going to see it visually is our SIG-X line is going to increase, right? Okay. Now, the SIG-X line increases, and it increases by $40 billion. But of course, that's just the SIG-X line increases. We want to know how much, our GDP will go up by, right? And it turns out that all we have to do is just use the multiplier, right? We take the initial amount, the initial increase is the initial, the $40 billion increase. That net increase is the initial amount increase in aggregate expenditure. We take that and we multiply it by the multiplier, by 5, right? And we get 200 billion, which is exactly the amount that we want, right? GDP to increase by. So what I hope that you notice is that there is something called the balanced budget multiplier, okay? The balanced budget multiplier will always equal 1. And what do I mean by that? Well, all I'm saying is that if we want our GDP to grow by $200 billion, okay, we will want to tax people exactly that amount and spend all of that amount, okay, exactly that amount. And our GDP will grow by exactly that amount, okay, by $200 billion. So that's why we're saying that really we're just multiplying 200 by 1 to get, the balanced budget multiplier effect, okay. This, by the way, will work no matter what the MPC is. So if my MPC was 0.5, it would also work with 0.5, meaning that obviously 0.5 would be a much smaller multiplier, okay, it would be a multiplier of 2, but the balanced budget multiplier would still be equal to 1. So if I, if I change this to 0.5, this would be a multiplier of 2, and if the government wanted to bridge the gap of GDP from actual to potential, and the gap was 200 billion, they would still need to do both increase taxes by 200 billion and increase government spending by 200 billion, and they would do that. And what I'd like you to do as an exercise is actually work out the numbers, right? So instead of 160 billion, this would be different, right? And instead, right, okay, so I think you would just go through it and you get the point. Now, some people might say, why don't you just do that all the time? Whenever you want to stimulate your economy and you don't want to incur more debt, why don't you just do, tax people a certain amount and spend that amount on government spending? 2 reasons. Number 1, remember that there's still an opportunity cost here. Our opportunity cost is that we are losing saving, right? When the government increases taxes, people consume less, but they also save less. And so that loss of savings could have an adverse effect on the economy, and we'll look at that a little bit later when we learn about banks and stuff like that, okay? So that's not necessarily very good. The other thing is, it's just an impossibility. In the United States, if any congressman or woman or the president suggests that they're going to raise taxes on people, they're pretty much done, if you know what I'm saying. So that really doesn't actually work in the real world to do that very easily. Obviously this mathematical logic works in reverse too. If we have an inflationary gap, the government will want to decrease taxes and decrease government spending, and then you would get basically the reverse effect.